I spent years inside the U.S. intelligence system learning one core discipline. You never accept surface explanations. You ask why something happened, who benefits, and what patterns repeat. That discipline is gone. What replaced it is something far more dangerous: intelligence that exists to reinforce political narratives rather than challenge them. The Kim Jong-un loyalty letter to Vladimir Putin was treated in Washington as a shocking development, an emotional flourish, or a propaganda stunt. It was none of those things. It was the predictable outcome of analytic negligence that has been accumulating for decades. When I was trained as an analyst, adversary intentions were inferred from behavior over time, not from press statements. North Korea did not suddenly discover Russia. Pyongyang has depended on Moscow for military technology, energy access, and diplomatic shielding since the Soviet era. After 1991, that relationship never vanished. It simply moved into quieter channels. What changed was not North Korean behavior, but America's willingness to observe it honestly. Intelligence reporting increasingly framed North Korea as isolated, erratic, and transactional, because that framing supported sanctions policy and reassured policymakers that pressure was working. The failure here was not lack of data, it was analytic distortion. Open source shipping records, arms transfer indicators, joint training signals, and diplomatic coordination patterns were all visible. They were just inconvenient. Analysts learned quickly which conclusions advanced careers and which ones caused friction. Saying North Korea was aligning structurally with Russia contradicted the narrative that sanctions were fragmenting adversary networks. So the assessment was softened, delayed, or buried in footnotes. The loyalty letter matters because it strips away the pretense. Kim did not speak in ideological language. He spoke in operational terms: unconditional support, permanence, shared confrontation. That is alliance language. The intelligence failure was not missing the letter, it was missing the conditions that made it inevitable. When intelligence stops asking why and starts asking how to defend policy, warning indicators become invisible. The strategic consequence is severe. Policymakers believed escalation control still rested in Washington's hands. They believed adversaries were fragmented, cautious, and reactive. In reality, they were coordinating patiently while U.S. intelligence reassured itself with recycled assumptions. The hard lesson is simple and unforgiving. When intelligence becomes fiction, surprise is guaranteed, and deterrence collapses without a single shot fired. The claim that North Korea operates in isolation is one of the most persistent analytic fictions I encountered, and one of the easiest to disprove if you were willing to look beyond briefing slides. Isolation is a political description, not an intelligence finding. From an intelligence standpoint, North Korea has always functioned as a node inside a wider support network, adjusting visibility rather than severing ties. What changed over the last 2 decades was not Pyongyang's behavior, but Washington's refusal to acknowledge the continuity of its external relationships, particularly with Russia. After the Soviet collapse, analysts declared the Moscow-Pyongyang relationship moribund because it no longer resembled Cold War patronage. That was a category error. Intelligence work is not about recognizing familiar forms. It is about tracking functional capability. Russia continued providing technical expertise, spare parts, training channels, and diplomatic cover, often through intermediaries or deniable arrangements. These interactions did not disappear, simply because they were inconvenient to quantify or politically awkward to brief. They became quieter, transactional, and deliberately opaque, which made them easier to dismiss for analysts conditioned to look for formal treaties and headline agreements. What was consistently ignored were the operational indicators. North Korean missile and artillery programs advanced despite sanctions that were supposed to starve them of inputs. Fuel shortages fluctuated but never collapsed industrial output. Military exercises evolved in ways that suggested exposure to external doctrine rather than purely indigenous development. These are not mysteries, they are signals. Yet intelligence reporting framed them as evidence of North Korean ingenuity rather than external enablement, because acknowledging sustained Russian assistance would have raised uncomfortable questions about sanctions enforcement and escalation management. This distortion fed strategic complacency. If North Korea was isolated, then its actions could be managed individually. If Russia was engaged elsewhere, then coordination was assumed to be minimal. That assumption was wrong. Russia did not need to publicly arm North Korea to benefit from alignment. It needed a partner willing to absorb pressure, stretch U.S. attention, and normalize confrontation with the West. North Korea served that function quietly and reliably. The Kim Putin letter did not create a relationship, it acknowledged one. The intelligence failure was treating decades of interaction as episodic anomalies rather than cumulative alignment. Analysts mistook silence for absence and secrecy for weakness. The hard lesson here is fundamental to intelligence tradecraft. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when dealing with adversaries who have every incentive to operate below detection thresholds. When policymakers finally confront overt signals, they call it escalation. In reality, it is disclosure. The damage was done long before the letter was written, when intelligence institutions chose narrative comfort over analytic rigor. In intelligence work, context determines meaning. A loyalty letter between two leaders is not interpreted by its tone, but by its timing, its phrasing, and the environment in which it is delivered. Washington treated Kim Jong-un's letter to Vladimir Putin as rhetorical theater, another example of flamboyant language from an isolated regime seeking relevance. That interpretation misses the point entirely. The letter was not written for Western audiences. It was written for insiders, partners, and adversaries who understand signaling in conditions of undeclared war. Kim's language was precise: unconditional respect, unconditional support, permanent and constant. Those are not diplomatic pleasantries. They are commitment statements designed to remove ambiguity. In intelligence terms, this is assurance signaling, telling a partner that alignment will hold even under pressure. That matters because ambiguity is what adversaries exploit to fracture coalitions. By eliminating ambiguity, Kim was advertising reliability, not loyalty as an emotional concept, but loyalty as an operational guarantee. The timing reinforces this interpretation. The letter emerged amid expanding maritime confrontations, sanctions, enforcement actions at sea, and rising U.S.-Russian friction across multiple regions. This was not coincidence. It was coordination. Kim was signaling that North Korea would not sit on the sidelines while Russia absorbed pressure alone in a multipolar conflict environment. That kind of signaling alters escalation calculations. It tells Washington that actions taken in one theater will generate consequences in others, even if those consequences remain deniable and indirect. U.S. Intelligence failed again by treating alliance behavior as something that must be formalized to matter. That is outdated thinking. Modern strategic alignment operates through shared interests, synchronized pressure, and mutual political cover, not necessarily treaties. Russia does not need North Korea to fight its wars. It needs North Korea to complicate American planning, strain resources, and normalize resistance to U.S. coercion. The letter serves that purpose by making coordination explicit without creating legal obligations that would trigger predictable Western responses. The strategic consequence is subtle but serious. When adversaries signal commitment and Washington dismisses it as bluster, deterrence erodes. Deterrence relies on accurate perception. Misreading intent invites miscalculation. The intelligence community should have recognized this letter as confirmation of an existing wartime alignment network operating below the threshold of declared alliance. Instead, it was briefed as a media event. The hard lesson is one intelligence professionals learn early, and policymakers often forget. Adversaries tell you what they are doing if you understand their language. When you dismiss signals because they contradict your preferred narrative, you are not being cautious, you are being blind. Sanctions are only as effective as the intelligence that enforces them, and maritime sanctions are where U.S. intelligence discipline has degraded the most. I watched this erosion in real time. Fewer analysts trained in shipping patterns, flags of convenience, port services, and naval signaling, and more reliance on automated tracking summaries that tell you where ships are not what they mean. The seizure of a Russian-flagged Venezuela-linked tanker under U.S. sanctions authorities exposed that blind spot in full view. Washington treated it as a law enforcement success. From an intelligence perspective, it was an escalation event that revealed how little situational awareness we retain at sea. Maritime operations are not neutral when major powers are involved. Tankers do not move in isolation during periods of high tension. They move as part of signaling ecosystems that include escorts, patrol routes, and diplomatic messaging. When reports emerged that the seized vessel operated under Russian flag and in proximity to Russian naval assets, that should have triggered a reassessment of escalation dynamics. Instead, the response was bureaucratic confidence, assert jurisdiction, cite sanctions, Project Calm. That calm was performative. It masked the fact that U.S. intelligence no longer integrates maritime enforcement with strategic warning. This failure connects directly to the Kim-Putin alignment. Sanctions pressure is one of the primary mechanisms Washington uses to coerce behavior. Adversaries adapt by building shared logistics, overlapping trade routes, and mutual cover. Russia, North Korea, and their partners do not need perfect sanctions evasion. They need sufficient resilience. Maritime networks provide that resilience. Oil transfers, equipment shipments, and dual-use goods flow through legal gray zones, while intelligence agencies reassure policymakers that enforcement remains robust. What was missing was escalation awareness. When enforcement actions generate coordinated diplomatic pushback from multiple capitals, that is not coincidence, that is network behavior. Intelligence failed to connect the dots between maritime pressure, alliance signaling, and rhetorical alignment. Each was briefed separately, stripped of strategic context. That compartmentalization is fatal in a multipolar environment where pressure in one domain is designed to provoke response in another. The strategic consequence is predictable. Enforcement actions meant to demonstrate control instead demonstrate overconfidence. Adversaries test boundaries, observe reactions, and adjust. When Washington acts without recognizing how its moves are interpreted inside adversary coordination loops, it forfeits initiative. The hard lesson is not that sanctions are useless. It is that sanctions divorced from integrated intelligence analysis become instruments of surprise, surprising us more than them. This is not a technical failure, it is a conceptual one. Intelligence stopped treating the maritime domain as a strategic signaling space and reduced it to a compliance problem. Adversaries noticed, they adjusted, and they signaled their alignment accordingly. One of the most damaging assumptions still embedded in U.S. intelligence is that war begins with declarations, treaties, or visible mobilization. That model is obsolete. What we are witnessing now is multipolar warfare conducted without formal announcements, where alignment is demonstrated through synchronized pressure rather than signed documents. Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran are not bound together by ideology. They are bound by shared opposition to U.S. coercive dominance, and that is more durable than any treaty language Washington keeps looking for. The Kim-Putin letter fits perfectly inside this model. It did not announce war, it confirmed participation. Modern alignment is about role specialization. Russia absorbs military confrontation in Europe. China manages economic and industrial depth. Iran pressures regional flashpoints. North Korea supplies strategic distraction, weapons development, and normalization of defiance. None of these actors need to coordinate publicly. They only need to understand each other's thresholds and red lines, and intelligence indicators show that understanding has matured over time. U.S. Intelligence missed this because it continued to assess threats in silos. Russia was treated as a European problem, North Korea as an East Asian anomaly, Iran as a Middle Eastern irritant, China as an economic competitor. That analytical separation made sense in a unipolar moment. It is dangerous now. Adversaries no longer think regionally, they think systemically. Pressure in one region is designed to force trade-offs elsewhere. When Washington fails to integrate those assessments, it responds tactically while losing strategically. The consequence is escalation without comprehension. U.S. policymakers believe they are managing discrete crises. Adversaries see a single confrontation playing out across domains. The loyalty language from Kim was meant to remove doubt about North Korea's role in that confrontation. It was a message to Moscow that pressure will be shared, and a message to Washington that attempts to isolate conflicts geographically will fail. The intelligence distortion here was subtle but devastating. Analysts continued to measure alignment by formal defense agreements and joint commands. That metric no longer captures reality. Alignment now operates through coordination of timing, rhetoric, logistics, and diplomatic posture. Those signals were present. They were simply filtered out as coincidence because acknowledging them would have required admitting that U.S. Leverage was declining. The hard lesson is one intelligence professionals use to understand instinctively. Adversaries adapt faster than bureaucracies. When your analytic framework lags behind reality, you do not get warning, you get surprise. Multipolar warfare does not announce itself. It reveals itself through patterns. Washington chose not to see them. The most corrosive change I witnessed over time was not technological or organizational, it was cultural. Intelligence stopped being a tool for understanding reality and became a tool for managing perception. Threat assessment gave way to narrative control. Analysts learned often, without being told explicitly, that certain conclusions created friction while others were welcomed. Over time, this produced a self-censoring system that rewarded reassurance and punished disruption. The result was intelligence that told policymakers what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. This shift explains why the Kim-Putin alignment was consistently underplayed. Acknowledging a quiet wartime alliance network would have conflicted with several preferred narratives: that sanctions were effective, that Russia was isolated, that North Korea was marginal, and that escalation could be tightly managed. Rather than challenge those assumptions, intelligence products were framed to preserve them. Language softened, confidence levels were overstated. Worst-case assessments were treated as outliers instead of warnings. Media dynamics amplified the distortion. Intelligence talking points increasingly mirrored press narratives rather than challenging them. When officials spoke publicly about adversaries acting out of desperation or seeking attention, those phrases migrated back into analytic products. This is backward. Intelligence is supposed to inform messaging, not absorb it. Once that boundary collapsed, analysis followed politics instead of evidence. The strategic consequence was institutional self-deception. Policymakers believed they were acting from a position of informational superiority. In reality, adversaries were observing U.S. statements, noting the gap between rhetoric and action, and adjusting accordingly. Kim's letter exploited that gap. It was blunt precisely because Washington had grown accustomed to ambiguity that favored its own narrative comfort. By removing ambiguity, Kim and Putin forced a reality check that intelligence should have delivered years earlier. The damage here is not confined to one case. When intelligence becomes an extension of narrative management, credibility collapses externally and internally. Allies stop trusting assessments. Adversaries stop being deterred by warnings they know are politically filtered. Analysts lose confidence that truth matters. This is how intelligence institutions hollow out without formal failure. The hard lesson is unforgiving. You cannot manage great power competition with curated reality. Adversaries test your claims against your behavior, not your press releases. When intelligence prioritizes narrative harmony over threat accuracy, it guarantees miscalculation. The Kim-Putin alignment did not expose a sudden shift in the global order. It exposed how long Washington had been lying to itself about the one already in place. Deterrence is not built on power alone. It is built on credibility, the belief that a state understands the environment it operates in and will act consistently with that understanding. Once credibility erodes, power becomes noisy but ineffective. What the Kim-Putin alignment ultimately exposes is not a clever diplomatic maneuver, but the cumulative cost of years of distorted intelligence and self-deception. By the time Washington recognized the signal, deterrence had already weakened, adversaries judge credibility empirically. They watch how often U.S. red lines shift, how frequently intelligence claims are revised, and how rarely strategic assumptions are revisited. When intelligence consistently downplays coordination among rivals and overstates U.S. leverage, adversaries learn that Washington's confidence is performative. They stop fearing escalation and start managing it. That is the most dangerous transition in any strategic competition. The loyalty language from Kim mattered because it tested credibility directly. Would Washington adjust its assessments? Would it integrate the signal into a revised understanding of multipolar alignment? Or would it dismiss the letter as theater and proceed as if nothing fundamental had changed? The early response suggested the latter. That tells adversaries that U.S. intelligence and policy remain disconnected from observable reality. Deterrence does not survive that disconnect. The strategic consequence is systemic. Allies begin hedging, neutral states discount U.S. warnings. Sanctions lose coercive force, military posturing becomes symbolic rather than stabilizing. None of this requires defeat in battle. It requires only repeated misjudgment. Intelligence failure accelerates the process by preventing timely course correction. By the time reality forces recognition, options have narrowed. This is how strategic narratives collapse. Not through dramatic reversals, but through accumulated disbelief. The American strategic narrative depended on the assumption that U.S. intelligence was clear-eyed, objective, and insulated from politics. That assumption no longer holds. Adversaries know it. Partners suspect it. Analysts feel it. Credibility, once lost, does not regenerate quickly. The hard lesson is the one intelligence professionals used to deliver without apology. Reality does not care about narratives. It responds to capability, coordination, and resolve. Kim Jong-un did not change the global balance. With a letter, he revealed how much it had already changed while Washington was reassuring itself that it had not. When intelligence becomes fiction, deterrence becomes memory.